I think San Pedro is the sort of dark horse of the three main psychedelic substances. And the reason I love San Pedro is because it provides some of the same stimulation as LSD. So it is activating, it can help with mood and energy, but it's really grounded and embodied. And one of my hypotheses is that the efficacy of microdosing, or why microdosing seems to be effective at a wide range of things, is because of its anti-inflammatory mechanism. That even at low doses, when psychedelics are used consistently, they seem to help mitigate or manage inflammation. And we know that inflammation is the root cause of a lot of chronic disease. It's kind of the body's way of yeah, I mean, if acute inflammation can be very healthy because it's the body's way of healing, but we often get stuck in these chronic inflammation patterns, which then can lead to various issues and diseases. So I think the other really beautiful thing about these low doses of San Pedro, when combined with different practices that help to regulate the nervous system, is it seems to be physiologically beneficial. And I think that's really important to focus on. Again, when you hear about microdosing in the mainstream conversation, a lot of the emphasis tends to be on the mind or on the psychology of what's going on. And I don't think there's nearly enough focus on the physiology of what's happening when we're taking these low doses of psychedelics. So I would love to see more research around that. How do psychedelics help with neuroinflammation? How can low doses help with HRV, which is an indicator of nervous system health? How can low doses help with endurance or fatigue? I think there's a lot of things that we haven't been able to explore yet as it relates to these low doses of psychedelics.
Welcome to the Microdose podcast, where we speak about the intersection between flow, psychedelics, and culture. How small doses create big shifts. This is the Microdose podcast. I'm your host, Gareth Catesy, and this week I'm joined by guest Paul F. Austin. Paul is the founder of Third Wave and the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. He is also the author of Mastering Microdosing. This week, our theme is Microdosing 101. What is microdosing? Who's doing it right? How are you doing it wrong? What are the main players in microdosing, aka psilocybin, LSD? And what are some of the lesser known substances people microdose, such as San Pedro and Ibogaine? We also speak about the global meta crisis we find ourselves in, and what role psychedelics can play in helping us have a bit of hope and faith in the future of humanity. I hope you enjoy this week's podcast as much as I did, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you. I'm here with Paul F. Austin, and if you've heard of the godfather of microdosing, James Fadiman, perhaps Paul is the cooler younger uncle of microdosing. So with that being said, if you've just clicked on this podcast, what is the latest and greatest in the world of microdosing in the current psychedelic sphere?
So I think the latest and greatest is the utility of microdosing for things beyond just depression or PTSD. From what I've seen, a lot of the mainstream conversation, and the reason that a lot of people get into microdosing psychedelics is because they really do need a boost in energy or mood. SSRIs are no longer working for them, or maybe they're sick of taking their ADHD medications. We've seen a little bit of focus and emphasis on, for example, the role of microdoses of LSD in Silicon Valley or in these creative startup founder contexts. And, I think what exists beyond that is this overlap of microdosing and nervous system regulation. So that's been something that I've personally been exploring more. And I think one substance that's not talked about enough when it comes to microdosing is San Pedro, or Wachuma, which is a cactus from the Andes that's been used for 3,000 years now. And that's partly just because it's very difficult to grow and very difficult to access. Psilocybin mushrooms, which Paul Stamets has talked a lot about, is incredibly accessible. I mean, you could throw a stone and find someone who is either growing their own mushrooms or knows where to get microdoses of mushrooms. And then LSD has been talked about quite a bit as well. It's much more difficult to source, but it is also commonly talked about. And I think San Pedro is the sort of dark horse of the three main psychedelic substances. And the reason I love San Pedro is because it provides some of the same stimulation as LSD. So it is activating, it can help with mood and energy, but it's really grounded and embodied. And one of my hypotheses is that the efficacy of microdosing, or why microdosing seems to be effective at a wide range of things, is because of its anti-inflammatory mechanism. That even at low doses, when psychedelics are used consistently, they seem to help mitigate or manage inflammation. And we know that inflammation is the root cause of a lot of chronic disease. It's kind of the body's way of yeah, I mean, if acute inflammation can be very healthy because it's the body's way of healing, but we often get stuck in these chronic inflammation patterns, which then can lead to various issues and diseases. So I think the other really beautiful thing about these low doses of San Pedro, when combined with different practices that help to regulate the nervous system, is it seems to be physiologically beneficial. And I think that's really important to focus on. Again, when we hear about microdosing in the mainstream conversation, a lot of the emphasis tends to be on the mind or on the psychology of what's going on. And I don't think there's nearly enough focus on the physiology of what's happening when we're taking these low doses of psychedelics. So I would love to see more research around that. How do psychedelics help with neuroinflammation? How can low doses help with HRV, which is an indicator of nervous system health? How can low doses help with endurance or fatigue? I think there's a lot of things that we haven't been able to explore yet as it relates to these low doses of psychedelics.
Yeah, just to back up, because I really do want to go down the San Pedro path, and just for maybe a listener who hasn't got a full grasp on what microdosing is, there's often that blanket term that it's subperceptual doses of psychedelics, and I've read in James Fadiman's new book that he kind of regrets almost that subperceptual um, description, and he almost called it like sub psychedelic now. So I just wanted to kind of maybe define what microdosing is, and maybe we can also just touch on some basic terms like inflammation, nervous system regulation, and how these might overlap. So just maybe like a basic grasp for someone new to this.
So microdosing is a very low dose of a psychedelic, usually a tenth or even a 20th of a therapeutic dose. So for LSD, it tends to be around 10 micrograms of LSD, and for psilocybin, it tends to be around 100 milligrams of dried psilocybin mushrooms like golden teachers. The idea with microdosing is that it is a sub intoxicating dose. I think Fadiman in his new book refers to it as sub hallucinogenic, um, which is similar to sub intoxicating. I do prefer sub intoxicating as a phrase because it suggests that you could still go about your normal every day, even if you feel slightly altered. And the idea with microdosing is that it's not just doing it once, but as part of a commitment to microdosing, it's really about the protocol of doing it 2 or 3 or 4 times a week for at least a month is the minimum that I often coach clients with or train practitioners. And that if you really want to see the efficacy from a microdosing protocol, it's important to do it at least twice a week for 4 weeks. Sometimes folks will do it 3 or 4 times a week for 4 to 6 weeks. Usually, I suggest no longer than 90 days, at least for an initial protocol. And then my rule of thumb is take 1 week off for every 3 weeks that you're microdosing. So if you do a protocol that's 6 weeks long, take 2 weeks off. If you do a protocol that's 12 weeks long, take a month off. If you do a protocol that's longer than that, just sort of have this flow because, um, anything that is consumed too consistently or too often, the body gets used to. And this is especially true for these serotonergic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin mushrooms or mescaline, which is found in San Pedro, that there is short term tolerance of about 48 hours. And so typically, what people advise is if you're going to microdose, do it every other day. Don't necessarily do it on back to back days. This was the initial protocol that Jim Fadiman outlined, which is 1 day on, 2 days off. So you have your microdosing day, you have the second day where you notice some of the afterglow, and then you have the third day where you're back to baseline before you rinse and reset. So I think those are really the fundamentals in terms of inflammation and neuroplasticity and nervous system regulation. I think that's a much sort of broader category. You can understand your inflammatory markers by doing blood work. There's something called I think your CRP markers, which indicate if you have high levels of inflammation. Usually, high levels of inflammation mean you're metabolically dysregulated or metabolically unhealthy. And your nervous system, a lot of people understand the nervous system as the autonomic nervous system, so sympathetic versus parasympathetic. In our in sort of the modern industrial West culture, we often find ourselves in a much more sympathetic, which is fight or flight, because of all of the input that we have on a moment to moment basis. And what they've shown with psychedelic work, even at low doses, is that it can help to re-regulate the nervous system to help us spend more time in a parasympathetic state or a state of rest and digest, which is often indicated by higher HRV or heart rate variability, which you can track and measure through a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or an Oura Ring or any other number of devices. So the sort of overlap between microdosing and nervous system regulation is definitely like a cutting edge, a leading edge of
Mm.
what we're exploring through this work. But I do think it might be the most important aspect of this work because chronic stress and chronic inflammation often underlie a lot of mental health
Mm.
issues. And so I feel like the um, majority focus being on depression and addiction and anxiety is useful, but it doesn't really get to the core
Mm.
mechanism of action. I think the core mechanism of action is the impact on the nervous system and sort of physiological inflammation. And so if we can have a more targeted approach to how microdosing helps us to spend time in the state of rest and digest, a lot of healing and good things can emerge from that.
Yeah, I think one of the ways it's maybe being sold incorrectly as like Prozac 2.0, where it's like a symptom based solution to something, and um, microdosing definitely brings you this heightened awareness of even just your breath or heart or feelings, emotions, body, and so it's this invite to these somatic practices or nervous system regulation protocols and things like that that can really give you a sense of where your baseline is and where you're like way far out. And so, yeah, I'd love to just chat about maybe some of the misconceptions around microdosing. I think you touched on a super common one is, I mean, I've had a consistent chat with a few people where I've microdosed, and it's like, how long was the protocol? It's like, oh no, I just did it once, 1 day. So that seems to be like the most common one for people that don't know. And I'm not sure if in America it's similar, but there's such a cultural reluctancy around LSD. And I don't know if it's the same in the States, but there's such a like, oh no, I won't do that and microdose it when it's actually so, I think as you and I know it's so amazingly beneficial for, yeah, things like ADHD and getting productive at work and just getting that little extra boost to, I guess, operate in this modern world. So yeah, if there's any other misconceptions that pop up or
I would say probably the most common misconception that I hear is about uh, like how much is an actual microdose. Like I hear a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, I'm microdosing," or "These are microdoses," or "These are microdoses of chocolates," and I'm like, "How much is it in it?" And it's usually a half gram or zero point
yeah.
0.5 grams, right? Which is way more than a microdose. A microdose is 100 milligrams. maybe 200 milligrams. For some people who are or have been on SSRIs or who might be a little bit older, like 60 and above, they may have a higher tolerance. So a microdose for them could be 250, 300 milligrams. But usually when I'm hearing people talk about microdosing in my community, in my groups, it's people who are young and active and not on SSRIs, and they think a microdose is a half gram. So I think that's one common misconception, is people think a microdose is much higher than it is. What that really is it's what I would call social dosing, where you're taking a low dose of a psychedelic because you don't want to drink alcohol, as an example, but you still want to feel a little altered, which is awesome. I think it's much healthier than alcohol, social dosing, but it's not microdosing. Microdosing is sub-intoxicating, and it's done consistently over a long period of time. I think probably one of the second most common misconceptions is the concern that microdosing is addictive, or that if I start to microdose, I may become dependent on it. And I think what's true with microdosing is it has no risk of physiological dependence. So there really, from what I've seen, there's not a lot of impulsive behavior. I mean, you have a minority, maybe 1 to 2 to 3% of people who might microdose, and they just feel like, oh, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. But for the most part, people who microdose, they do it sporadically, 2 or 3 times a week for a period of a month or 2 months or 3 months, and then they may never do it again, or they may
Mm.
take a month or two off, and then they may start to do it again. I really look at microdosing more as a supplement, and I think that's probably the third misconception, is because microdosing is, let's say, a drug or a substance. I hear a lot of people say, oh, like, if I'm doing this consistently, then there's a psychological dependence on microdosing. And I always respond back to that, well, you also might have a psychological dependence on exercise, or you might have a psychological dependence on eating healthy, or you might have a psychological attachment to getting 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night. That doesn't mean it's unhealthy for you. And so I think there also needs to be this reframing around microdosing, that doing it consistently 1 or 2 days a week for a period of time. I've been microdosing now for a decade. And I'll do it for a few months. I'll take a few weeks off. I'll go back into it and do it a few months. And I'm always sort of experimenting, and I look at it as a supplement. So just like with other supplements I take, like creatine or lion's mane or fish oil, I always cycle on and off these supplements, where I might be on it for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, and then I'll take a few weeks off. And that's true for these supplements as well. But I think we really have to look at these microdoses of psychedelics as nervous system vitamins. Is a really good frame for them, that they're really helpful at mitigating or managing inflammation, which has um, incredible sort of downstream effects on our overall physiological health. So just to recap, the first misconception is microdosing versus social dosing. The second misconception is this might be addictive, or I might become hooked on this like I was with SSRIs. And I think the third misconception is that doing it consistently over a long period of time is bad or unhealthy. And those second and third sound very similar, but I think
Mm.
it's important to be very clear about the nuance there, that from a neurobiological perspective, right, psychedelics are not physiologically addictive. Um, However, they are physiologically beneficial. And so we need to sort of walk that line between what's addiction and dependency, and what is just a healthy relationship with a substance that, if done consistently, can improve my life on a day-to-day basis.
I guess that's always the fine line, um, and possibly like easy to tip over at times, because I think for a lot of people there would just be the conception that it would be like coming off SSRIs. And so I think I heard you speak on a podcast with Dave Rabin recently, where it was just speaking, like the goal is really to get back to homeostasis, and back to the state where you aren't dependent on medicines or something to uptake your or reuptake your serotonin. Um, and then getting back to that baseline thing where people that have become dependent on SSRIs or benzodiazepines or whatever, there's this terrible period to wean off, And I guess there's probably that just uninformed fear that that's going to happen, that you experience the psychedelic glow and you find more flow and productivity and things are sharper, and then what happens when you go off. And um, just from my personal experience, like you're saying, it's like this gradual wave back down to baseline, but baseline seems slightly better than it was before. At least in
Well, I think a
my
lot of this is
experience.
also, it's how are you utilizing this window of neuroplastic enhancement through microdosing to integrate or establish better behaviors.
Mm,
So, what we often encourage is to not look at microdosing as a magic pill. I think that's an expectation or a lens that can be detrimental, because then we're just stuck in the same pattern as with SSRIs or ADHD medications. Okay, if I take this pill, it's going to fix my issue.
mm,
Whereas the fundamental fact is taking any pill is not going to fix your issue. You are going to fix your issue. The pill ideally makes that process easier. And psychedelics do that because of how they upregulate BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. So a lot of the long-term efficacy of working with microdosing and psychedelic use generally is how do you leverage the window of neuroplasticity that is opened through a microdosing protocol to change who you are.
mm,
And that may mean, if you've never meditated before, committing to the establishment of a meditation practice where you choose to sit on the cushion every day for 20 minutes for at least a month. Or if you eat a lot of processed food, you may commit to changing that behavior and eating a low inflammatory diet full of fruits and vegetables and pasture raised meats and eggs and other nutrient dense food. So I do think that lens is really important. This is why we train practitioners through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute, because it's much more than just give someone a low dose of mushrooms or give someone a low dose of LSD or take someone on a therapeutic journey. So much of the efficacy of coaching as it relates to psychedelics is what are the non-psychedelic modalities that are woven in to support behavioral change, so someone can achieve the outcome or the goal that they want to. And so we really have to look at psychedelics as a catalyst, not necessarily as a pill that's going to fix our problem. And it acts as a catalyst to enhance our neuroplasticity so we can actually make the changes that we know we're capable of making, and we're not just continuing to sort of get in our own way by repeating dysfunctional patterns that have held us back for years, if not decades.
yeah, and that seems to be one of the things. Like you said, a lot of these things are about changing who you are, or wanting to grow and change, and so much of it, as you've used the term depatterning, is almost like a remembering, and it's almost like that strip away of the uh, archetypes and personas that aren't really yours, and a breakaway of the stories that aren't even your own, like to pull back into your own story. And that subtle, I mean, just in the lens of microdosing, that subtle build up of your capacity for perception of one's own inner awareness, or that ability to sit on the mat a bit longer, or just this awareness of what the food's doing to your energy, how it's fueling you, or what happens when you move your body. It can just create this expansion of awareness, really, of oh shit, this is working for me, or this is detrimental, and how can I like shift this behavior. So just to go back into the past of who Paul F. Austin is, was there any big depatterning shifts that happened for you via psychedelics, or what led you to, yeah, the work that you do currently, and yeah, just that shift for you?
Yeah, I started taking high doses of psychedelics about 15 years ago now. So I'm 34. This happened after my sophomore year of college. I was 19 at the time. The first ever experience I had was with about 2 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. And that experience was interesting and uh, definitely provoked my curiosity, but it wasn't necessarily a massive before and after psychedelic moment. That didn't happen for me until about 5 months later when I tried LSD for the first time. And it was about 2 tabs of LSD, which is equivalent to like
That'll do
200 or
it.
200, yeah, 200 or 250 micrograms of LSD. And I did it on a, spring day, beautiful spring day in Michigan with a group of friends. We went out to the beach, we went hiking in the woods, swimming, just sort of hung out for the day. And it was just really magical and beautiful. And that summer, I ended up taking LSD maybe 4 or 5 times. And then over the next couple of years, took LSD probably 10 or 15 times, usually between 1 and 2 tabs, and almost always with a friend or 2 or 3 in nature. Typically at the same place in Holland, Michigan, which is called the Saugatuck Dunes, which are these really beautiful sand dunes on the coast of Lake Michigan. And I had been raised in a pretty traditional religious family in West Michigan, church every Sunday, no exceptions. My parents were strict, but not fundamentalist. They were progressive, but they also, wouldn't let me watch, for example, rated R movies till I was 17. Would never let me drink alcohol in the house because it was illegal. So they were definitely strict
By the book.
in many ways. Yeah, by the book. And because of that sheltering, I always felt like some of these urges and desires that I had. So, for example, I started to smoke cannabis when I was 16. There was something wrong with me, or there was some sort of shame around who I was, because I was always a little rebellious. I was always independent. I was always, just did what I wanted to do, how I wanted to do it. And so when I had these first experiences with LSD, they really helped me to depattern from the shame and the cultural conditioning that I've been raised in, to realize that the issue wasn't with me so much as it was with the culture and community that I had been raised in. That it was just, pretty behind the times, pretty conservative, pretty traditional. And so the early use of LSD really inspired me to pursue an unconventional path in my 20s, and helped me to see that life was much more malleable than I assumed it to be, and that I could do whatever I wanted, really. And that was partly because I was very fortunate that coming out of undergrad, I had no student debt. Um, and so I could travel and teach English abroad. And, at 24, I started my first business, which was teaching English, like a teaching English educational platform online. And then when I was 25, I started Third Wave as an educational platform, because I heard about microdosing in the Tim Ferriss podcast through Jim Fadiman. Thought, oh, how cool would it be if I could do this more consistently? Because I remembered back to my early experiences with LSD, and remembered that for like a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks after that high dose LSD experience, it felt really easy to meditate consistently, to eat healthy, to be more open with my friends, more connected. Like I just felt better. And then eventually, a lot of that feeling would sort of dissipate. And then I'd be like, shoot, where did that go? And so I'd do another high dose LSD experience. Right now,
Mm.
reflecting back, I realized what was happening was I had this neuroplastic enhancement. I had reopened the critical learning period. But at that time, I didn't have any idea of that. I just know I felt better and life seemed better. So when I heard about microdosing in 2015, I thought, oh, what if I could elongate that neuroplastic window so it just doesn't just last for 2 or 3 weeks, but it might last for months at a time. And so I started to experiment with microdosing in 2015. And at the same time that I started to experiment, I started to just go deep into the rabbit hole around everything related to psychedelics, especially the history of
Yeah.
psychedelics and why they became illegal in the first place. And
Well,
so I
I just
just,
wanted, sorry, yeah. I just
well, I
wanted
just
to touch
assumed.
touch there
Mhm.
on, just to go back a touch, because I think it's such an important note, and I don't want to skip it. But like that shame you felt from experimenting with cannabis or whatever the first time, and it's largely due, which is obviously a why you guys called your company Third Wave, but due to our loss of our connection to the first wave of psychedelics, that we have a sacred right to use these substances, and it's largely like lost in the modern West culture. Um, and obviously now we have that opportunity to bring back things like initiation and rites of passage into the West in a psychedelic space. And yeah, I just wanted to segue into that of just a brief cover on the first, second, and third wave, and why you called your company Third Wave.
Yeah, I mean, so I
Opportunity.
studied history in undergrad, right? So I am and continue to be a student of history. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from history and who we've been as humans in the past, and so that's the context I came into this work with. And the way the name came about is I was living in Budapest taking LSD with a couple friends. We were going to third wave coffee places because there's something called third wave coffee, which is the artisanal coffee, single origin, like really beautiful latte art. And we were taking acid, and it just sort of emerged. What about this third wave of psychedelics? And so as I started to sit with that inquiry, what is the third wave of psychedelics, it sort of occurred to me that, well, the first wave was the ancient and indigenous use for thousands of years. The second wave was the counterculture, when psychedelics were reintroduced into the West in the 50s and 60s, largely through the invention of LSD and the discovery of psilocybin mushrooms in Oaxaca. And then the third wave of psychedelics being the marriage between the ancient indigenous ritual or ceremony of psychedelic use and the sort of scientific and ethical approach to how we work with these medicines. And I've always seen microdosing as the leading edge of the third wave, that if we are to develop cultural acceptance of these medicines outside of strict clinical institutions, then we must lead with low doses in non-clinical formats, because it mitigates a lot of the potential risk involved when psychedelics are not used within very strict containers.
Yeah, and Jamie Wheel's got a model for this where he's almost like 10% of the people of the population should never do psychedelics. Those are like your narcissists and sociopaths and stuff. And then you've got 10% of the population that should be your psychedelic explorers, the people that really push the edge of, I guess, the conscious boundaries within oneself and explore these substances. And then the rest of the 80%, you may be in these rites of passage moments, like, you adulthood, like man to boy, I mean, sorry, boy to man, then possibly like your wedding, and then close to death, something like that, like these big rites of passage, initiatory moments. And yeah, I feel with microdosing, it's this amazing pull towards people to obviously start to develop a practice and relationship with these substances, but there is the allure to strip it of all like myth, meaning, ritual, and stuff, as it's kind of pushed and sold as I like Prozac 2.0. And the other side of it is how can you help people to experience these high dose life changing experiences not being while not falling in the trap of like consistently seeking peak states and not integrating the experiences. Like, I think my kind of introduction to psychedelics was similar. And once I'd found a bit of relief from my pain and happiness and stuff, it kind of became a crutch to always fall back on if I fell out or fell out of my comfort. I kind of knew I was a couple grams of mushrooms away from then feeling the afterglow, whilst having not done the integration work. And I think that was like my maybe like 10 years ago kind of consistent experience with psychedelics. And now it's something I kind of treat with a lot of caution and preparation and reverence, that I take my time before the next journey. And I kind of really wait till I've like embodied and felt the lessons. And so I don't know if from your side if there's a voice of caution to microdosing too much, or perhaps pursuing psychedelic experiences too frequently. Seems like quite a common at least for me, it seems like a common one in this medicine space where people are just ceremony after ceremony, and you're like, hey, hang on, it's like your 10th one this year. Yeah, slow down a bit.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting. There's a lot of nuance here, and it's a good
Mm,
question. There's not like one right or wrong answer, right? Like
for
I
sure.
mentioned when I was 19, the first couple of years that I got into psychedelics, I was doing acid probably once a month. And that felt good. It felt needed. It really helped me to deal with the sort of undiagnosed depression that I had at that point in
Mm,
time. It helped me to have the courage to really um, do something totally unconventional. I moved to Turkey when I was 21, where I taught English, and then soon after I moved to Thailand. It helped me to come to terms with the shame and the guilt that I had been raised in, and helped me to release that. So I think because we are raised in this conditioning of the modern industrial West, there are a lot of people when they get into psychedelics in the early stages, they may do an ayahuasca ceremony once a month for a couple of years, or they may do a high dose of mushrooms once a month for a couple of years. And I think that's, in my personal opinion, that's part of the process of the sort of delayering of all
mm,
of the shit that we've accumulated, not just in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of our ancestors that in the West, at least, have been cut off from this medicine for 1700 years, right? So there's a lot of shedding and delayering to do. Now, if you ask me about my current psychedelic use, right, I'm doing high dose ceremony maybe once every 6 months,
yeah.
in terms of like a really intense breakthrough dose and experience. I've been doing that for the last probably decade now, where I really look at it. The metaphor that I love is like the dentist. Like every 6 months, you go to the dentist to get a deep dental hygiene clean. Every day, you brush your teeth, you floss, you make sure that your overall hygiene is really well taken care of. And I look at psychedelics in a similar lens that once that initial deconditioning process has been gone through, and it will be different folks for different strokes. There may be some people who it's just an experience or two or three and they're good. There may be some people who do consistent medicine work for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and that's what they need. um, but I do think getting into this place where you can go relatively inconsistently. Might be once a year, might be a couple times a year, might be once every couple of years, even as a way to come back into deep relationship with yourself, with nature, with God, whatever that looks like.
Mm,
Occasional microdosing or low dose work for some people that may be here and there. For others who have a predisposition to depression, that could be more often. But I do think it's important not to stigmatize or criticize people who may look at psychedelics as a better antidepressant. And I think that's also
yeah.
a risk. Um, that I hear the people who say, "Oh, microdosing is just Prozac 2.0," and I would sort of push back and say there's nuance in that microdosing is a much healthier, much more effective, much more useful version of an SSRI. You don't get withdrawals. It's not fucking up your serotonin. It's not something you're taking every day. A microdosing protocol, like we talked about, is maybe a couple times a week for a period of a certain amount of time before you sort of transition off of it and then back onto it. So I really have no problem with even educating and talking about in a more public way. Like, if someone wants to microdose for the rest of their life, cycling on and off of it, good on them. I don't see any
Yeah.
problem or issue with that, as long as they still have a relationship and a reverence with the medicine. And if they're going into high dose work, that they really take the time that they need to prepare and integrate appropriately. Um, and I think if people are only microdosing, they are certainly missing out on this greater opportunity of transcendence and non-duality and the mystical experience that can often come from high dose therapeutic work. And like, everyone has to come into it when they're ready to come into it. You can't force someone into doing high doses of psychedelics. It really has to come from a place of full agency and choice on their behalf. And so I think as psychedelics become more culturally normative in a way and accessible, hopefully people can have that choice, because I think the biggest block to that choice currently is prohibition, and the fact that psychedelics are by and large Schedule 1 substances or highly illicit substances everywhere in the world.
Yeah, I know with Theory U from Otto Schwame, he speaks about like so many of our problems are this disconnect from self, disconnect from other, disconnect from nature. And like the rational, cynical part of my brain can be like, people are going to these journeys too consistently, or I've done those journeys too consistently. And then taking the time to like obviously assess, prepare, and integrate the experiences when every time I venture back into the bizarre psychedelic realm, um, there is this crazy ongoing teaching and lesson that seems to occur from a mind and intelligence that's higher than my own. And how frequently I visit definitely kind of has an impact on the depth of the lesson, I would say. And yeah, for me, it has been this like fine line between, am I in pursuit of the Holy Grail and looking for healing, truth, and connection within myself and to others and to God or whatever, or my purpose, or is it this, I'm falling in and trapped in the lobby of Hotel California because it is this escape, not an escape, but it certainly can allow you to feel lighter
Very
and more,
seductive. It can be very seductive, right?
yeah, in this modern world. But at the same time, we live in this really crazy evolving world that is very hard to keep up with. And um you know, I've heard you mention that quote, and I love that one as well. We have like Paleolithic emotions, what's it, medieval institutions and godlike technology. um and
Good
then
one.
it's such an amazing one because I mean at the end of the day, like our nervous systems are hardwired as like monkeys trying to figure shit out, and we've got like transhumanism and you know AGI and who knows what else literally like on our doorstep. And for me, that little bit of help, and I've heard you use the term adaptability as well, but that pull back into my heart and like hope within the world and that there is some divine plan unfolding is very helpful in this modern world because it is so easy to fall to nihilism and despair. So why do you think psychedelics are, I mean, we can go like a tad speculative and mythopoetic here, but why are they emerging at this time in the world and having like a, you know, renaissance?
Yeah, there's very practical reasons for it, and there's very mythical reasons for it. It's both. With a question like this, it can be difficult to know where to start.
Mm.
I think there are probably two main entry points. One is mental health, just to be very clear and direct, right? We have a mental health epidemic. Uh, Hundreds of millions of people struggle with depression. Tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people struggle with addiction, anxiety. Um,
Suicide.
we suicide, PTSD from war or sexual assault, and the medications that we have numb the symptoms, but they don't necessarily help us to get to the root cause of these systems. And one could argue that the reason we have a mental health epidemic, the reason there are so many people who are depressed and anxious and addicted and traumatized, is because we live in a profoundly sick society. And I think it was Krishnamurti who said it is, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it is no measure of health to be okay in a society that is so sick. Um, and so I think that's a great starting point. Now, the question then becomes, why are we so sick? Right? Now, Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century predicted that God is dead and we killed him, right? That because of this overt focus in the West on science and reductionism and sort of this mechanistic industrial linear thinking, we've killed the mystery, the awe, this sense of um, curiosity of what life is and why we're here. Aldous Huxley referred to this as the onward march of the machine, that we are becoming consumed by the machine. And what that has meant then over the last several decades, if not centuries, is we have consumed our natural resources and environment. We've extracted from our environment everything that we could to benefit ourselves, refusing to live in reciprocity, refusing to ask what is it that nature and the trees and the animals and life itself needs from us so we can continue to live in harmony, right? So we have this deep sense of dysfunction when it comes to our relationship with the natural world. And this is in large part because of Christian colonialism and its perspective that nature is something to be conquered, and its missionary tendencies to pull indigenous peoples away from these pagan or animistic lenses and into this sort of Judeo-Christian lens that heaven is the ultimate way, and if you're just good here then you'll be good, and blah blah blah. So I think the reason psychedelics are coming back into popularity is because at a soul level we recognize the value of these substances in helping us to reconnect with this kind of mythic sense of what it means to be human, especially in the age of AI and robots and this way of being machines, and this capacity to be human, to have a soul, to be messy, to be vulnerable, to live in our feminine, whatever that looks like, is essential for us to heal that dysfunction or that rift that exists between ourselves and the natural environment. And that, I mean, I didn't mention this in my story before, but that's more than anything what inspired me to get into this work initially, was because of all of those experiences that I had largely with LSD in a natural environment. I just came to have a deep love and reverence for the natural world. And so when I was choosing or deciding the vocation that I wanted to pursue, to me, the very obvious choice was normalizing psychedelic use, helping people to be more skillful at how they work with these substances. Because if we can upskill everyone and how they work with psychedelics, there's a deep reverence and love for the natural world and environment that comes online from that. And so I saw psychedelics as sort of the greatest leverage that we had to shift our consciousness in a quick enough time to address the meta crisis that we currently find ourselves confronting.
Yeah, yeah, as in this meta crisis, and I know Terence McKenna was quite an advocate for this, but it is one of the fastest buttons you can push to bring awareness to the sentience of nature, and that there is something far more bizarre and mystical going on with our connection to Mother Earth and the cosmos that I think, yeah, might have been sadly lost due to the popularized, at least John lens of Christianity and Jesus and stuff, as opposed to maybe what the Gnostics and those kind of mystics and stuff believed. Um, yeah, and part of the other thing, and this was a theme that we spoke about at our intensive in Costa Rica, and for me, uh, yeah, hit home a lot. Was that capacity to hold a paradox, and within a paradox is also a polarity at times, and sometimes they're complementary, and sometimes there's a paradox. And my peak psychedelic experience at that time in Costa Rica was at one point just partaking and witnessing the unfolding of what was happening in my psyche, and then the paradox was like then I had to, from the witness being the one side, had to partake in the experience, and also had this kind of leverage and capacity to act. And I think perhaps with why we so sick is this disconnect from self, others, planet, and all the substances and modalities of the world pull us into a constant disconnect. Whether that's maybe SSRIs and we kind of numbing our pain, numbing what's happening around us with bullshit TV, and numbing the kind of, yeah, like a global pain and suffering that's happening in the world, and psychedelics, I think, pull us back into that heart space, and it creates that coherence between like mind, heart, body, soul, earth. And yeah, I think when you have that coherence in line, like you want to act in highest service to yourself and then to others. And so much of what I think the problem is this like hyper individualistic culture that we find ourselves in, where it's like fuck everyone else, like I need to get to the top or buy this at the expense of, yeah, like the planet. And so the more we can pull back into that heart space, I think we've got a bit of hope. Yeah, so what are some of your, yeah, views on how psychedelics can help adaptability?
Well, I think this goes back then into the sort of notion of the meta crisis. Is we live in this world that's becoming increasingly uncertain. It's hard to know where we'll be a year from now, much less 5 years from now, much less 10 years from now. We're sitting or leaning over a precipice with AI, with political polarization, with income inequality, with ecological destruction, and we don't know where we'll be. And so aligning with tools that are clinically proven to help us adapt to uncertain circumstances, I think is one of the most beneficial things that we can do. And psychedelics have been proven to do this with their impact on BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity, helping the brain to become more neuroplastic, to become more malleable, more adaptable, which then allows us to shift and change our models and our assumptions rapidly. Because I think one of the big problems that especially entrepreneurs, founders, creatives can fall into is they have an assumption, they execute against that assumption, and then they attach themselves to that assumption, even if it's clear that that assumption is not working in the real world. And so the capacity to continually meet reality where it is rather than where we wish it was, which is a very important point, right? We often come in with these stories or these perspectives, the assumptions of why isn't reality like this, or why doesn't reality do this, or why isn't this fair, right? There can be a lot of resentment, there can be a lot of anger that can come from that, rather than just saying, okay, this is how it is, right? This is the situation that we are confronting, that we are navigating, that we are dealing with. And that's, I think, also why psychedelics help with adaptability, because they help to downregulate the fear response from the amygdala, which allows us to better confront difficult and challenging situations. And when we can confront difficult and challenging situations with courage, right? Courage is so critical and important in terms of what we need and what we're looking for. Then all of a sudden we can face reality as it is, realize that more likely than not, it's not going to kill us. Although maybe that'll change in the next 5 or 10 years. We'll see. But physically we'll be okay. So can we allow ourselves to continually go through this process of death and rebirth? Can we allow ourselves to be continually transformed by dealing with reality as it is rather than how we wish it were? And I think psychedelics as tools make that process much easier because of their impact on neuroplasticity, their impact on our fear response, their capacity to help us to be more courageous, to be more vital, to be more creative even. And so that notion of adaptability, I think, is really critical. As part of the practitioner training program that you went through, we talk about our sort of model for transformation, right? Awareness, self-regulation, motivation, interpersonal, and collective. We sort of review this as our model for transformation. I think what all of that exists within is this bubble of adaptability, that if we can continually and constantly learn how to adapt to reality as it is, then we can become more aware. We can better regulate our nervous system. We are able to access motivation and creativity. We have better interpersonal relationships, and we can align ourselves with what the greater collective wants from us. But the meta skill of adaptability is essential to that process of transformation, of allowing ourselves to be swallowed whole and reborn again and again and again.
Yeah, because I think if you aren't, like, I mean, just for starters, like defragging your nervous system, if you're only like operating in a mind space, like you're pretty fucked if you have an awareness of what's happening around. And so as that awareness starts to deepen with what's happening, like there's all these amazing tools now to regulate your nervous system, from breath work to movement, psychedelics. You can even have like biological interventions and all these things to down regulate and pull oneself out of that sympathetic nervous system response, to then like pull back into oneself and act from courage and move from a place that's maybe slightly more purposeful and of heart. And I think for me, like specifically microdosing psilocybin allows me to just pull back into that heart place and have like a bit of hope, because I think right now, like if you can just kindle a bit of hope in the world, like it's kind of a good enough place to be, as you're saying, from that adaptability. Like instead of resisting what is, it kind of helps you share the story of what you actually think is happening versus what should be, and just kind of, yeah, I guess, move from a place of deeper purpose and alignment.
Yeah, faith,
Um,
right? Faith is really
mm,
essential. And I think
yeah,
faith and hope are fairly intertwined.
and yeah, I mean we've got probably a minute or two, and I think you have to go. But you know, we this will be a hard question to wrap up quickly. But we might be experiencing the corporatization of psychedelics, and yeah, how do we avoid turning these sacraments into prescription and subscription services, and how do we like maintain the reverence of where these psychedelics come from into where they're going, which, I mean, we could be going from a third wave to fourth wave soon. So um yeah, what would the um message be to kindle the light um of, I guess, reverence and psychedelics?
Well, it goes back to what you mentioned with Jamie Wheel and the sort of notion of the 10% being psychonauts, which he probably got from either Terence McKenna or Ken Wilber. They both talked about the importance of having this psychonautic core, right? And so there will always be this psychonautic core, and that core will be the nucleus of how this medicine is held and the sort of heart of it. And there's this 80% of people that you mentioned that would fundamentally benefit from working with psychedelic medicine, even within a clinical format. And so my anticipation is that one of the great upsides of the medicalization of something like psilocybin or LSD or MDMA is by the FDA approving these psychedelics and medicalizing it, the DEA is required to reschedule these substances. And the rescheduling of these substances, I think, is even more essential than the fact that they are becoming medicalized. Because when these substances become rescheduled at the federal level to Schedule 2 or 3 or 4, all of a sudden research is way less expensive. These substances become way more accessible. The prison penalties are way reduced for having access to them or being able to utilize them. So I do think on a practical level, the FDA approval of these medicines is really essential, with an understanding that people who are struggling with depression or addiction or PTSD, they now have a better option that can actually help them. And if they want to continue to deepen into a relationship with these medicines, there's that 10% core of practitioners and facilitators and the underground network that will welcome them into ceremonial spaces if they want to really engage with this in a much more sacred and reverential way. So I think really being able to hold that both and, that the medicalization is useful and practical for the reasons that I mentioned, and knowing that that doesn't mean that everybody has to be an advocate or everyone doesn't have to be sort of enthusiastic about this, but there will always be this sort of core or nucleus that is holding the reverence and the sacredness of these medicines. and people will be able to find them and to work with them. And I think this also speaks to this sort of mycelial approach of spirituality as more people leave dogmatic, mainstream religion, specifically Christianity in the West. Is I do believe psychedelic churches offer, they offer another option for folks to still have and engage in a sacred spiritual practice, but to do so outside of sort of traditional dogmatic policies, with entheogenic medicine as a sort of central aspect of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This is fun to jam for a while. If folks want to learn more, I mean, Third Wave, thethirdwave.co, right? They can check that out. We have our own podcast that I've hosted for a number of years. We have a training program that Gareth went through as well. So folks can learn more about our training program at psychedeliccoaching.institute. And then I'm also on social, mostly Instagram, X, and LinkedIn, Paul Austin or Paul Austin 3W, depending on the platform. So if folks have questions from this, they want to reach out and connect, social media is a great place to do that.
Thanks. I'll put all the links in the show notes. Thank you so
Great.
much,
Thank you,
Paul.
Gareth. Thank you. This is fun.